Good morning. Welcome to this year's very special Fireside Chat. This is our first webinar for the year, so thank you for joining us. Today, we have a very special chat with Soo Kim, who is a former CIA analyst and now a practice area lead at Logistics Management Institute. Again, my name is James Kim. I'm the chairman and CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce. And this is a very special day on talking about North Korea. For those new to AMCHAM, we represent over 800 member companies and affiliates in Korea who are major stakeholders in the Korean economy. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the US-Korea alliance and also that of AMCHAM. The business community in Korea plays a critical role in deepening the economic partnership between the two countries. In this context, I'm very grateful that we have with us a true expert who's going to share with us an inside look at North Korea, particularly nuclear proliferation and their implications for the US business community in Korea. Before joining Logistics Management Institute, Soo was a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation, focusing on national security issues in the Indo-Pacific, the intelligence community, and US Homeland Security. She began her career as a Korea analyst in the CIA and served in the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and also at the American University as an adjunct professor. She received a doctorate, an MA, and an MIPP in International Affairs from Johns Hopkins University, and a BA from Yale University. We also have with us Jeff Jones with Kim and Chang and one of our board of directors at AMCHAM, and he's going to moderate today's session. As a lot of people in Korea know, Jeff is one of the longest serving and distinguished leaders at AMCHAM. He also currently serves as the chairman of AMCHAM's not-for-profit organization called the Partners for the Future, as well as leading AMCHAM's DPRK committee. So now Jeff will moderate this fireside chat with Soo, followed by a Q&A session from the audience. So if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So Jeff and Soo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome everybody to this really important opportunity for us to chat about what's happening in North Korea. This is an important week in US-Korea relations. There's a lot going on this week, and this topic on North Korea is extremely timely and important. And welcome, Soo. We're delighted to have you. Soo is one of the foremost experts on North Korea and what's happening up there. And of course, it affects us all. We've all been concerned about it forever. And the concerns grow and wane from time to time, but certainly our friends up in the north like to get attention. So, Soo, if we could get right into it, what is, in your view, really North Korea's intention? What do they hope to achieve? Not only through this nuclear program, but their entire policy objectives. What's their end game?
I think, well, first off, thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity to talk about one of my, I would say my passions, which is, of course, the Korean Peninsula. And as you mentioned, this is, North Korea tends to be topical and cyclical, but I don't think that the threat ever really goes away. Turning back to the weapons development, negotiations, and the Kim regime's overall vision for the Korean Peninsula, I think the fact that he has been so diligently pursuing weapons development, whether or not his people continue to suffer, whether or not inter-Korean relations are in a state of disrepair, it does not matter to him. And what we're seeing is that Kim does not really have a particular, I would say, a constrained timeline when it comes to negotiating with the United States or South Korea. I think what Kim wants to do is develop his capabilities to an extent where the U.S. extended deterrence is no longer going to be credible. That the U.S. missile defense systems are not going to be sufficient in deterring, of course, the threat of a contingency on the peninsula, but also what's also important here is Kim's willpower. And we've seen over the past several years that his willpower cannot be deterred, despite COVID, despite economic difficulties. He's marching forward. And I think that even though we've seen a change in administration in South Korea and we're seeing more alignment between Washington and Seoul over their North Korea policy, there is still that space where Kim can continue to operate, and he's still seeing that there is a great deal of vulnerability in the alliance relationship, in Seoul's own readiness in terms of defense, but also I think the state of the South Korean population and society's overall awareness of the North Korean threat. So long-term goal, of course, is to, and I think people still debate over this because it sounds really absurd in some respects that, third generation Kim would be so fixed on unifying the Korean Peninsula under a, authoritarian dictatorship of North Korea. It doesn't make sense to many observers in this day and age because we can't really imagine a robust democracy like South Korea becoming quite the opposite. But that, I think, is still it's still one of the visions that Kim has, and I think that having the weapons capabilities and trying to drive that wedge between Washington and Seoul are part of his the means to get to that end, I would say.
Certainly that objective of his is something that must be deterred, and for a whole variety of humanitarian, economic, democratic, and social reasons, and that's why North Korea garners such attention from both the U.S. and Korea, but all governments, Japan, China, and others as well. So one of the stated objectives of U.S. policy has been to deter nuclear weapons. Are we being successful? Can we be successful? Is that an appropriate policy?
So I think if we were talking about the state of Kim's willingness, his country's demonstrated capabilities to provoke a true contingency, a true crisis on the peninsula several years back, when we didn't see this rapid increase quantitatively and qualitatively over the country's nuclear weapons, the ballistic missiles, we're seeing hypersonic missiles. I think the answer or the debate might have been shaped differently. Now we're seeing not just a nuclear armed, more determined Kim Jong-un, but I think Kim also has a perfect example in Russia, where Russia had threatened NATO to use the threat of, Putin was threatening to use nuclear weapons if NATO were to intervene in the Ukraine. And that, to Kim Jong-un, I think, one, validated the utility of his weapons program, but it also showed that as a country that still remains outlawed in many respects, he cannot survive without the nuclear weapons. And the debate, of course, has changed thanks to the war in Ukraine, and I think also the instability that we are seeing gradually develop between the United States and China, and potential conflict in Taiwan. Also, I think, brings the question of deterrence a much more of a, it's less of a research or, let's examine kind of question, but it's becoming much more of a realistic problem. And I think that's why we're seeing increased debates in South Korea too, about perhaps South Korea potentially developing nuclear weapons. As for the United States' capability to truly deter North Korea, I think there is a grain of reality, let's say, that there is that prospect where we will not be able to come to either Seoul's defense in the right time, or that we will be able to really truly defend against or defend or preempt North Korea's missile or nuclear attacks with the existing capabilities. So that is pushing the South Korean government and the United States government to hold, I think, more substantive dialogues about where deterrence is and the areas where both countries need to develop and advance their defense capabilities jointly, bilaterally, trilaterally, and also, I think, indigenously as well. So as much as Kim feels like he is the outsider, I think he still has many cards to play, which of course does not mean, it doesn't bode well for the rest of us.
So given the difficulty of deterring any program, nuclear program, would the world, the United States, South Korea, be better off recognizing and simply accepting and then dealing with some kind of limitation?
I think that, that debate has, I think, resurfaced and then submerged and then was brought back to the policy debates over the past couple years, I would say. Again, thanks to the rapid progress we've seen in North Korea's weapons capabilities. If we do recognize, well, first off, I think in some ways, we've already recognized one, of course, that nuclear weapons exist. It's a staple of North Korea's strategy. But, there's a fine line, I think, between informal recognition and that official recognition that Kim Jong-un is probably aiming for. If we do accept and acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, that, I think, is going to open up another can of worms, which entails Kim asking the United States and South Korea to justify the presence of US troops on the peninsula. Why do we need, the presence of US troops if there's peace on the Korean peninsula? Kim has, let's say that he promises to use his weapons for peaceful purposes. I don't think people are going to take his word as bona fide. So I think that will put not just South Korea, but also US interests in a very difficult situation. And that would, I think, produce a cascade of reactions in the region. As you mentioned, North Korea is not just a US or South Korea policy interest, but Japan, China, Russia are all very interested in what Kim has to say and what he's going to do. So I can imagine a couple of those countries in this region might be okay to live with the fact that there's a nuclear North Korea, but I would think that Japan would also would be gravely concerned about it. And how would South Korean citizens, businesses, society be able to react, and how are the dynamics going to change between the two countries? I think that would put Kim in a severe advantage strategically, but also in terms of shaping Korean society as well. So there's much more to it, I think, than just officially recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and just moving forward. But it will, I think, create more insecurity in the region.
The US-Korea economic relationship is stronger and bigger than it's ever been. It's a critical relationship, not only to the two countries, but to the world economic order, quite frankly, the whole supply chain that we have grown to learn the importance of. Korea is a major supplier of a lot of goods that the world needs. And this economy is very important to the world. Any aggression by North Korea would be a disaster economically. We've seen the impact that even a small country like Ukraine can have. if if we miscalculate his intentions, and if we miscalculate the deterrent impact, that's a big miscalculation. How do you feel we're doing in terms of our deterrent? And where do you see the Biden administration going in that respect?
There's always that small, maybe not even small, but a true chance of a miscalculation. I think no matter how much we study the country, how much we have worked on the issue, and how much we know about leadership dynamics, society, economics, vulnerabilities for any country, but I think especially for North Korea, because we've seen I think a quantitative increase in the amount of information that we're getting on North Korea, but also from North Korea, from escapees and then people who have been inside the country. But the fact of the matter is, nobody knows what Kim Jong-un is thinking. So I think even as intelligence analysts, a lot of our not thoughts, but a lot of our analyses are based on some set of assumptions and expectations that we have formed based on years of research. And it's very challenging to say with any degree of certainty that this is the direction that North Korea wants to go. But thankfully, we have history. We also have great collectives like AMCHAM and think tanks and business communities, policy specialists, and each group, I think, brings a different set of different pairs of eyes on the issue. So that, I think, helps in terms of dispelling some of the misconceptions. But I think it's because of that room for miscalculation. That's why we not only have to prepare for dialogue and engagement, but a risk of miscalculation with North Korea is not going to, it's not a scenario where it's going to be peaceful, but it's the chance that there might erupt a contingency or a crisis in the region. And if you're not prepared for that, which includes not just informing society, but also preparing your troops and making sure that you have updated training and drills, and not just computer simulated exercises, but true physical exercises that are going to bring the troops closer to reality. Without those preparations, it's very, I think the space or the gap of miscalculation widens. So the training, continued willingness to engage in dialogue with North Korea, no matter what Kim does, I think still shows that the United States and South Korea are sincere about wanting to establish some kind of credible peace on the peninsula. How the United States and South Korea are doing, I think, given that we've seen a change in administration, that also coincides, of course, with an increasingly unhappy Kim Jong-un, because he probably would have preferred to have continuity in the Moon administration's policies. Now we're seeing the reverse in many respects, and this doesn't obviously help him with the tactical wins and losses. But by and large, even if we had a administration that was more open to further engagement with North Korea, that is not going to encourage Kim to give up his weapons or to seek peaceful means, or even consider bringing more freedom and giving his people more freedom, because that clearly does not help his, it's not just his leadership and policy interests, but it's his personal interests, I think, that he cares most about.
So can we feel safe?
That is a good question. And again, I go back to the debate that we see sometimes among policy professionals, that to prepare and to build up our defense capabilities is actually the opposite of trying to promote peace. But again, we're dealing with a regime that has never really shown continued, and I would say maybe irreversible steps toward peace. It's always been a step here, step forward, move several steps back, and we've never seen a true progress toward peace between North Korea and South Korea. So without that, without actually preparing ourselves for the worst case scenario, it's difficult to say that just expressing willingness to dialogue and being accommodating to Kim's whims is actually going to put the Korean society in better security.
Yeah. The region, of course, is very interested in this issue. It's not just a U.S.-Korea issue. Japan used to have much more of a say in what happens in North Korea. They seemingly having less influence, I think. But China is big and bold, and China maintains seemingly a good relationship with North Korea. As the tension rises between China and the U.S., do you see this having any negative implications for inter-Korea relations or U.S.-North Korea relationships?
The challenge that we're seeing right now with China, and I think the large China factor, is that we should not expect China to be, again, similar to North Korea, to stay with us on a progressive path to reducing North Korea's nuclear threat and actually convincing the Kim regime to denuclearize, to reduce tensions, and consider other alternatives to what he has. China, I think, and China-North Korea relations, China's position writ large in this problem does, I think, create this sort of cascade effect in the region where it's going to affect not just bilateral relations between the US and China, but China's decision to situate itself, either closer to the United States or closer to North Korea. Right now, it's looking like it's more towards North Korea, clearly. That decision, I think, bolsters and emboldens Kim Jong-un even more. It validates his position, and he knows that he has a reliable backing, that they might not be allies, but they are clearly working towards a common, I would say, adversary, which is, of course, the United States, and I would say South Korea and Japan also figure into it. So the China-North Korea dynamic, I think we tend to expect more from Beijing than what is realistically possible, given Beijing's interests politically, economically, long-term goals. So I think we do need to be a little more cautious in laying out expectations, but also understanding that there are vulnerabilities that we should look to when it comes to finding ways to, maybe pressure is not the right word, but finding ways to bring China to the table and making sure that as a member of the region, that it does have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, I would say, to cooperate with the United States, with Korea, with Japan, with the United Nations, in terms of sanctioning North Korea, and making sure that we do hold both China and I think also North Korea accountable for their actions.
You mentioned earlier, Sue, that Ukraine and developments in Ukraine have probably validated Kim Jong-un's view of the world and his own position. There's been a lot of talk recently about him supporting Russia and in the war through supply of weapons, and he's apparently denied it. But do you see Ukraine emboldening Kim Jong-un to upgrade his whole program and perhaps the tension?
Well, North Korea, I would say, the weapons ambition existed long before the conflict between Russia and Ukraine happened. This was kind of baked into North Korea's strategy for generations. So it doesn't really have it clearly has an effect in the way Kim Jong-un is thinking, the way he values and puts a price tag on nuclear weapons. But I think we do have to sort of make it clear that, if things had fared poorly for Russia in the one, extremely poorly, let's say, to a point where Kim realizes that the weapons are no longer of use, I don't think that would have happened. The weapons he knows is key to his own survival. But I do think that having observed Russia, Putin, make threats of nuclear use, and seeing the United States and the international community, rightfully so, become concerned about nuclear proliferation, the risk of nuclear war, escalation, he knows that that's also a card that he currently has. And if he were to focus even more resources and concentrate his efforts on, he could also use that. And the risk, I think, of not just escalation, but the risk to his own safety, and I would say to his own life, is something that he would also have to consider if he were to pull that card. But he's also saying that the threat that Russia made did not really trigger an existential question for Putin. So that, I think, helps Kim sort of calibrate if and when he does wish to re-engage with the United States in dialogue and negotiations, that there was an example, and he could either use that to strategize, or he could use that as a negotiating, it's not a negotiating chip, but he has an example to draw, and it's the validation that nuclear weapons is a good insurance card or insurance policy for Kim, and it's also, I think, it affirms to him that isolated nations like himself, like his country, the value of nuclear weapons, I think, rises even more for Kim Jong-un and his goals and his intentions.
Yeah, one of your underlying assumptions is that his intention is unification. And some of the folks in our audience this morning believe that his intention is more self-survival than unification. I suspect he's very concerned about self-survival and maintaining his position. But if it's just self-survival, that's an easier game than unification. What's your view on that perspective, that he's not so much about unification, but just surviving?
I would say that his own survival surpasses the goal for reunification. Reunification is not going to happen if Kim, well, it might under a fourth generation Kim with the same goal, but under his timeline, if we're just thinking about the life of Kim Jong-un, Kim 3, unification doesn't happen in his timeline, if that is part of his timeline, unless he is alive. And I would say that the nuclear weapons program, the threats that we see, even the display of his daughter a couple of times, I think last year, it all just links us back to, if you're going to deal with North Korea, you obviously have to deal with the Kims and the nuclear weapons. So they go hand in hand. And I think that unification of the two Koreas, it's not an existential goal for the Kim family, but it is the supreme ambition, or the supreme mission, I would say, for the Kim regime. So it is very important. And I think that Kim also believes that having nuclear weapons and using it to threaten and to shape South Korean society, not just with the weapons, of course, but we could also talk about, North Korean efforts to shape and influence South Korean society, and to also stir and provoke, driving a wedge between the United States and South. They're all part of plans that help Kim, of course, enhance his survivability, but also the longer term goal of unification. So they do go hand in hand. But again, you can't have unification if the person who's driving it is not there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we, with those of us who do business here, the deterrence is of critical importance. So we appreciate your advice and continuing role in making sure that both the US and Korea maintain a strong deterrence. That's vital to all of us. And in terms of that deterrence, I'd like to talk a little bit about the current state of the North Korean military, military capability. We've heard their weapons are old. He's got some new missiles, but everything else is falling apart. What can you tell us about the state of their military readiness?
We know that North Korea, again, the self-defense or the national defense is basically the utmost importance for all North Korean citizens. And I would also kind of qualify national defense as the defense around Kim Jong-un and his family. So it's not a broad concept where he is looking out for the interests of the entire North Korean population, but they are there to serve him, and they serve lengthy military services. We know that in North Korea's military, their active duty it far outnumbers their South Korean counterparts. But as you mentioned, the equipment is old. A lot of the equipment dates back to the 50s and the 70s. So we've got a quantitative advantage for North Korea, but in terms of quality, when you're talking about the quality of conventional military capabilities, there is this gap, and this is where the nuclear weapons, the missiles become very much important to Kim Jong-un. And that would also be one of the motivating factors for the buildup of missiles and other nuclear capabilities that we've seen. And we've also seen that North Korea sometimes likes to also use biological weapons, chemical biological weapons, and as we know that they're developing those capabilities. Add to that, the cyber capabilities that we're seeing, hacking into the cryptocurrencies, and being able to whisk away, I think, close to like $1 billion without much repercussion. So Kim, I think, is very much aware and sensitive to the fact that his military, looking at it, the overall qualitative picture, cannot really stand up to the modernized, much more high-tech South Korean troops. At the same time, I think, again, going back to the fact that the country does not really operate under international norms, allows North Korea to, the disadvantage, the quantitative or the qualitative disadvantage doesn't seem to figure so much when you have nuclear weapons, and you can use it to threaten a South Korean counterpart that does not have nuclear weapons and is not a nuclear weapon state. And this is why we're seeing this continued drive with the development. And also, we do, I think, have to pay closer attention to what's also happening in the cyberspace. So whatever North Korea lacks in terms of the actual qualitative capabilities, it's finding other ways to sort of compensate for that.
One of the issues that I think about every now and then is, we pay a lot of attention to the nuclear weapon development program, and it seems to dominate the dialogue. But the conventional weapons also can do an awful lot of damage, and disastrous damage to the economy, to our relationship to businesses here. And in some respects, prefer that we kind of put the nuclear program as a second priority and make sure that our deterrence program is conventional and
Sure.
extremely strong towards any kind of aggression. What's your reaction to that thinking that, we shouldn't put so much emphasis on the nuclear program? And part of the argument for that is, look, they're not going to use those nuclear weapons on the South Koreans. They might use them on Japan, they might use them on the United States, but they're not going to use them on the South Koreans. So what do you react to that kind of thinking?
I think you're absolutely right in that, especially for our South Korean friends and people who live in South Korea, the threat of nuclear weapons it's worrisome, but there is that other possibility of a conventional military, let's say a surprise attack on one of maybe the islands, and that I think is much more of it's an effective way for North Korea, one, to surprise us, to get a reaction, but also it's a good way for Kim to test the resolve of the United States when it comes to providing that security umbrella to South Korea. And if that conflict does expand to the region, which is, I think, something that I think as policy professionals, we do keep that, I think, in the back of our minds, because the threat of a nuclear attack from North Korea, as dramatic and as disastrous as it's going to be, in some ways, I think perceptually, it becomes a much more of a remote concept. Of course, we haven't seen it happen, but I think that threat of a North Korean nuclear attack does seem to become much more realistic in this day and age. But I do think that it would be in Kim's interests, in North Korea's interests, if they were to, because they lack the qualitative conventional advantage, whatever gains it could make in the initial, let's say the initial sprint, is going to put North Korea at an advantage. So if they were to, we know that a good chunk of the North Korean military is concentrated along the MDL, because Kim knows that you got to attack first, make that advantage, and while Seoul is scrambling to make sure all the shelters are working and people are it's going to be a total disaster. That also gives Kim more time while Seoul is scrambling. So it does become, I think, important, and we do have to take into consideration that a nuclear contingency might not be just a straight pure nuclear attack, but think about it as a combination of conventional military capabilities being demonstrated to their full, and then gradually, of course, escalating. I think that might be something that, it's not that it might be, but it is a concern that when you talk to, I think, especially folks who have studied the military dynamics between the two Koreas and really understand how North Korea's military operates, that topic does come up, and it's actually it's heartening, I think, to see sometimes in Korean press when they do mention it, because that is a concern, I think, that's shared not just in South Korea, but I think also amongst US scholars and researchers who are looking at it, not just from a purely nuclear proliferation aspect, but also from the overall set of conventional capabilities that North Korea has.
But one of the things that Trump said and seemed to move in the direction that was a little troubling to many, including myself, that he was going to withdraw U.S. troops. But the whole issue of troop reduction, troop withdrawal, where do you stand on that, and what would be your advice to the current Biden administration about those kinds of issues?
Well, I would say that we are, clearly in a different security environment today. And we also have a US and South Korean administration whose overall, I think, concerns and strategic interests seem to be aligning more. So I think that is it's a positive. But the question about, plus or minus 5,000, take a few here, bring a few there. I think that topic itself, if I recall, it's not just the threat of withdrawal that was concerning, but the fact that we were basically quantifying a relationship or numeric, putting numbers to a relationship that should be, it should exceed and surpass, and based on 7 decades of trust and reliance and support for both countries. I think that was at the heart of the matter. That was also something that was concerning to folks in South Korea, but also I think for policy professionals like myself, because we're not just talking about how it's not an experiment where you take 28,500 and you decide by this date we will scale back, we're going to subtract 500 and see where that goes. But that has ramifications, not just in terms of the number of troops, but think about the message that it's sending to not just our South Korean allies, but other countries around the world that are looking to the United States for security assistance and a longer term relationship. So that was, I think, a concern, but also think about how that's going to impact preparations, training. We know that the South Korean military, we're seeing a decrease in the number of troops. We're seeing shortened military conscription times, and that clearly has an effect, a domino effect, I think, in not just South Korean preparation, but allied preparation. So it opens up, I think, a box of other questions that I don't think may have necessarily thought about 4 or 5 years ago under the Trump administration. And that, I think, for folks who might just see peace and tension and security dynamics in a more black and white kind of an issue, the withdrawal of troops seems to signify that we're moving towards peace. But think about what's happening, I think, above the 30th parallel, where we're seeing weaponization, where we're seeing increased belligerence and threats from Kim Jong-un, his sister, other North Korean officials, and it doesn't put us in a safe spot for the United States and also for South Korea.
Yeah, one of we talked a bit about China and the implications of China-North Korea relations. One of our watchers is concerned about the China reaction, particularly given China's desire to appendicize Taiwan. And do you see China using North Korea as a leverage point to get to Taiwan?
I think that North Korea becomes, or it already has been, a convenient card for China for a while, because it knows that it's a tinderbox of surprises in the region and in terms of security. So it does become a very useful card for China, especially at a time like this when we're seeing tensions on the brink of, I mean, we're not at a point where it's erupting, but we keep seeing indications and more expressed concerns from former officials and security experts that we do have to keep our eyes on North Korea, but also Taiwan, and how that is also going to impact perceptions of security for all the parties involved. So I do think that I would think that for China, the North Korea card would be handy. And I think on the flip side, for North Korea too, if we were to see a contingency, a Taiwan contingency at any point, it might open up an opportunity for Kim to also get involved. Again, because if we were to take a look at the example of Ukraine, we have seen that the US, the responses that we've seen from the United States following the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war has not been as full hands-on, I would say, as some folks had expected or hoped, which gives Kim, I think, a free pass to continue to provoke and develop and really not face much of a consequence. So I would think that if the tensions were more immediate to Kim, geographically, proximity-wise, then there would be even an incentive for Kim to look for an opportunity to contribute to that provocation. And that in turn, I think, is going to make it more difficult for the United States and South Korea and Japan and other like-minded countries to deal with basically two contingencies in that region.
Yeah. Well, China appears to be a little easier partner to deal with because they want to make money. And that seems to be key policy for the Chinese regime to maintain power, is to continue to make money for its people. And so that's an advantage that we have. Do you see ways that we could use China more effectively with North Korea as a leverage point ourselves?
So one challenge that we have seen, I think, over the years is that because economics and security and politics have been so intertwined, that to pressure China economically, we know, or we fear that it's going to have consequences on our security. And that's precisely why we saw, during the Moon administration, this hesitation to stand up and be a little bit more firm when it comes to dealing with Beijing. So I think one key, I think, to bringing China and getting China to cooperate more and to pressure is that there will, of course, be consequences for any decision that we make. And I would take the example of South Korea, where we have seen Beijing's retaliation for THAAD. We've also seen political sort of indirect pressure to tell South Korea that if we were to more closely align with the United States on the Quad or other US-led efforts, that there will be consequences. But one thing that I remember from President Yoon's, I think this was during his campaign days, was that he also made it clear to China that it's not just China that has the capability to pressure South Korea. It's not just South Korea that has the vulnerabilities, but he mentioned that just as South Korea is vulnerable, there are Chinese vulnerabilities. And he hinted at the fact that Korea could also use that, maybe not as directly, but he was trying to tell, I think, Xi that, it's not you who just hold the cards. And I think even though we didn't take that extra step to pressure, but that also sends a message to China that it's not just going to be us fearing retaliation economically and you ruining the profits of the chaebars and boycotting South Korean pop culture, but because South Korean and Chinese economies are also intertwined, to have that backlash go both ways, I think it does spell consequences for Beijing.
Yeah. One of the implications of all of the increased missile activity launches has been a focus on South Korea's capability. President Yoon made a statement earlier that maybe we should begin our own nuclear weapon development program. Not, I guess not so surprisingly, but about 70% of the population expressed support for that. If the South Koreans decide on their own that they want a nuclear capability as a deterrent to the North, what implications does that have for the relationship, particularly the US-Korea relationship, but also the inter-Korea relationship?
Well, the fact that we are seeing more discussions about South Korea's nuclearization, and I would say efforts on from both US experts, but also South Korean experts who do not want to see this, that I think and despite all of these efforts to discourage, the fact that these conversations do keep coming up, it does underscore the threat perception that South Korea feels towards the threat of a nuclear or North Korean nuclear attack or contingency. So I think we do need to be attuned to the concerns that our allies have, and revisiting that topic of extended deterrence. I don't think Seoul is. If President Yoon were to put himself in President Biden's shoes, and let's say a close country like Japan needs or has depended on South Korea's security for 7 decades, and Japan asks South Korea to come to its defense at the risk of sacrificing Seoul, Daegu, Incheon, and so forth. He understands that the burden or the pressure that would impose on an allied country is not a trivial matter. So I don't think that he's expecting Washington to outright say, okay, we're going to come to your defense at the expense of DC, Los Angeles, San Francisco. But what I think Seoul is looking for, especially in light of the developments between Russia and Ukraine, tensions between US and China, Taiwan, what they want to see, I think, is not just the capabilities, but concrete. The verbal promises are not going to be enough, because we can promise Seoul that you have 28,500 troops. We've been there for 7 decades, but for folks who are living in that territory, that doesn't seem to be enough, especially if you feel like your northern neighbor is nuclear armed. It has the potential to use it. Whether or not that would happen, that's a different story, but there's that possibility. So the concerns I think we're seeing in Seoul, to me at least, in the recent couple of years over South Korea's nuclearization, seem to be much less cyclical or topical. But the fact that it's 70% of society thinking this does sort of raise the alarm about what's actually happening security-wise. Whether actually getting the United States buy-in for South Korea's nuclearization, I think that is a pretty tough road at this point. So a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago actually, President Yoon sort of mentioned the security situation. I don't think he was really trying to convince the Biden administration right away that it should allow Seoul to nuclearize. But the fact that he's also elevating the conversation and also hinting that this is the reality of our security, and it's pointing, of course, to the urgency that the Korean society, businesses, institutions are feeling, but also it underscores the need, I think, for there to be something much more concrete and I think executable and implementable when it comes to deterrence, and that's that missing piece that we're not seeing. And to be fair, how are you going to demonstrate it if there's no contingency? So there's that too.
Yeah. Well, so we have run out of time. This has been delightful, informative, and thank you so much for coming on with us. I want a yes or no answer to my final question. I know that a extremely intelligent person like you who's been doing analysis your career, it's very difficult to give a yes or no answer. But I'm going to challenge you. Are we safe?
Well, I'm a realist, so I will say no, because I think it's better to be safe than sorry and to be extra prepared. But that's just me.
And for those of you listening, Sue's answer no means yes, we're safe, because she's worried about it, and so she's going to make sure the deterrent is strong. In any event, thank you, Sue. We appreciate you
Thank
so
you.
much. It's just been delightful, and I turn it back to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Sue and Jeff. Based on the audience that we have today, I think that this was a highly insightful and a very deep conversation. So thank you both very much. I did not like the ending because you are creating some fears in all of our audiences. But as Jeff said, maybe this is the way we kind of prepare ourselves mentally and to have the right communications with our headquarters as well. And that's what we as leaders in South Korea running multinational companies should really have a good perspective on things that are important. So thank you both. And Sue, I look forward to seeing you back in Korea. We want to have you as a big part of our AMCHAM ecosystem. And thank you, Jeff. You did a great job as a moderator. Have a good morning, everyone, and have a good evening, Sue.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.